Evan McMillan was the heir to a great fortune. His father, Archie McMillan, was the proprietor of a mining and foundry business. The business was good. Archie was planning to one day leave it all to Evan, but only if he followed in his footsteps and ruled with an iron fist. Evan's father saw his workers as subhuman, simply made to be broken and moulded any way he saw fit. But Evan did not. He made friends among some of the staff, and were planning to start a union together under Evan's guidance, but he could not tell his father for fear of being beaten even more fiercely than he already was. Thanks to this hostile work environment, production was always high and the money kept flowing. We all know at some point, empires must fall, and Archie McMillan's mental health began to deteriorate rapidly, and the ever-looming threat of impermanence began to take hold. Evan swore to his father that he would protect their life's work regardless of the cost. No matter what his father asked of him, Evan would do absolutely anything to protect the estate, their business, and his infinite wealth. Although work consumed much of his life, Evan was an avid sketch artist, much to his father's dismay. He saw these artistic endeavours as a waste of time and unproductive. He often found himself sketching the embellished tales about how his uncle was killed by a bear, and how Archie had killed it with his hands alone just to pull the head of his brother from the bear's stomach. Another tale he began to draw is how his mother was pulled under by a strong current and drowned. His mother was a kind and beautiful woman, and something about the way his father told these stories, the lack of emotion, the slight smirk, it just didn't sit right with him. Evan's uncle was nothing like his father. He was a man of dignity and fairness, a mentality that surely in Archie's eyes would have drove the company into the ground, with the promise of fair wages and workers' rights. These stories would change every time he heard them, and he knew deep down that his father murdered his own brother and Evan's mother in cold blood just to keep the business afloat and all the money for himself. He often contemplated killing his father, standing over him while he slept, holding a great stone over his head. He could do it. He could finally emancipate himself, but his love for his father outweighed his hate. Or perhaps there was less incriminating ways to get rid of him. Workplace accidents happen all the time. Of course, Evan would never deny his father's wishes, no matter how heinous they were, and regardless of his father's lack of reason. He began to emulate his father to the point where he relished in the physical punishment of employees, severely beating a man with a 2x4 after making a flippant comment about his late mother. He had terrible dreams about what he was becoming. He couldn't decide if this is what he really wanted. His conscience was split two ways. He idolized his father, but resented him all the same. One night, Evan walked into his bedroom to find all his sketches had been torn up, and his father standing behind him. His father knew about the union. They had sold him out for a few bucks. He waits for his father to swing a punch, but it never comes. He ominously tells Evan that he has good instinct, and he can't find the right words to say to his father. Emotions begin to overwhelm Evan. He couldn't believe that people he once called friends would throw him under the bus for the same kind of greed that his father yearned for. This was the last straw. Evan led his colony of workers unknowingly to their demise, as he ordered them into the mining tunnels in what seemed like business as usual, one last time. He detonated the explosives and both sealed the mining tunnel and the fate of his employees. The true number of people that Evan led to their final resting place is uncertain, but it was likely in the hundreds. Their families would never receive justice, as Evan was gone without a trace, and there were no leads as to where he would have gone. As for Archie McMillan, his body was found in a locked warehouse, with nobody to look after him. He had simply starved to death. All the wealth he gained was insatiable, and yet he died, ironically, from a lack of sustenance. Philip Ajomo came to America in search for a new life. His home life in Nigeria was filled with death and destruction. He had witnessed multiple war crimes as a young boy, and along with the brutal killing of his family, he could never understand why they would do such a thing to his humble village. He had simply been a byproduct of being born in the wrong place at the wrong time, with an everlasting war for territory being at the centre of it. He watched as the place he once called home go up in flames, the locals burnt and tortured. As the men were sleeping, Philip thought of how he could get his revenge on these people. Guns? He had never fired a gun before in his life, and they would just run away. A machete? They would just overpower him. Kerosene. Yes. He would burn them all as they slept, immolate them for all that they had done to his friends and family, and he did exactly that, but burning himself in the process. Laying there, ringing his bell in his village for a final time, a bell that was once a forewarning of danger, became the very sound of death itself. After fleeing the country, he knew he needed a second chance and would jump at any opportunity. Philip found himself a job at Auto Haven Wreckers. This was a small, humble scrapyard which seemed innocent enough on the surface, but underneath, unspeakable things would take place. This was a front for a mob operation, and the local police were bribed and paid off to turn a blind eye to the atrocities being committed, as what was seemingly only a graveyard for vehicles turned out to be for people too. Ojomo wasn't even slightly fazed or bothered about what went on behind closed doors. He had seen crimes beyond comprehension in his homeland, and as long as they didn't involve him, he also paid no mind. His job was simple. He fixed cars and handled the crusher. The crusher was a job he particularly enjoyed. A car went in and a small metallic cube came out. It was a simple task that required merely pulling a lever. The turning point came when Philip noticed some blood coming from one of the uncrushed cars. His breath laboured and eyes wide, he slowly opened the trunk to find a young man, gagged, bloodied and bound. His gaze met Philip's and he could see the fear in his eyes, a fear he knew all too well. Philip untied the man and he tried to make a break for it, but he barely made it 10 feet before Ojomo's boss stopped him, wrestled with him for a few seconds and then slit his throat right in front of him. Philip was furious. He demanded answers for what he had just witnessed. That's when his boss told him that he'd been nothing more than a simple executioner, as more or less every car had a soul in them, as this was a service the scrapyard provided to certain clients. This is when Philip knew that this could not continue. He could not allow this man to live. His blood was boiling. He had been led under false pretenses. Just knowing that he was merely a henchman for this sadistic psychopath drove him into a fit of rage. He lunged straight at his boss and threw him in the crusher. Without a moment's hesitation, he forcefully held down the lever and slowly let it compress. The sounds of panicked screams and cracked bones resonated through the air. The little that remained peeking out from above the crusher was the former mob boss's mangled head. Ojomo grabbed it and pulled head and spine out of the body. He quickly fled the scene, never to be seen again. Max Thompson Jr. is a name given to a child that was so cast away from society that not even his parents wanted to give him a name. He was simply referred to as Boy. Born horribly disfigured, it was a face only a mother could love, and yet she rejected him too. Evelyn and Max Thompson Sr. were wealthy landowners, and with such a prestigious household name, they were the upright, snooty types that had no room for shame or disappointment. Much to their chagrin, they were stuck with Billy. If his parents weren't so ashamed that they had created such a monstrosity, they surely would have given him to the circus as their latest freak show attraction. The only logical solution for them was out of sight, out of mind, and so they kept him captive, situated in a bricked-off room away from the eyes of the general public. Billy's father was good friends with the local chief of police, and would invite him and his fellow deputies round to the farm and present Billy as some kind of entertainment. His father ordered him to kill the farm animals while the policemen stood, watched and laughed. They all laughed at him, provoked him into senseless killing time and time again. This went on for several years, and with only a television to keep him company through those isolated nights, voices began to stir in Billy's head. It didn't take long for the contemplation of murder to quickly take hold, to put an end to the mistreatment. He was going to take revenge for all the neglect and hurt he had received for so long. Just like any other day when the chief and his cronies rolled around for another dose of amusement, he acted, and swiftly bludgeoned all the officers that surrounded him and broke free from his shackles. Just before the chief tackled him to the ground and took the hammer from his hands, Billy pushed him away and ran as fast as he could. The chief caught up with him, with the police dogs quickly on his trail. Billy knew what he had to do. There was only one way out of this situation. His sheltered life from the outside world and mistreatment meant he was only born for one thing, and that is killing. He swiftly took care of the dogs, because at that point it was just self-defense. The chief was already weak from the scuffle, and his gun was out of ammo. His overwhelming strength broke the officer's arm, and he took the hammer and hit him over the head. Billy tossed him into the pig pen, and in his concussed state was met with hungry swine ready for their next meal. Billy continued to live at the Colburn farm right up until his disappearance, taking out his deranged violence on the local wildlife. His anger and jealousy for the creatures that spent their lives without boundaries only boiled over into mass killing. Running through the cornfields, Billy chased and slaughtered whatever he could find. The bodies of his parents were never found, presumably also fed to the pigs. The only thing that remained at his childhood home were the farm animals that had been sliced open and butchered. The rights to Colburn Farm were quickly finalised, with the land being split up and sold off as quickly as possible. However, nobody wanted to buy the farmhouse. The horrors that had taken place there, and the tragic story behind it all, was enough to put off even those with more money than sense. Sally Smithson once lived an ordinary life with the hope of one day starting a family with her husband Andrew. The recently married couple had a plan to live happily ever after in a wooden cabin built by Andrew himself. Andrew worked as a lumberjack, and of course, this is not a job without its risks. One day, Andrew's foreman had to pay Sally a visit. Before the words could even leave his lips, she knew the unthinkable had happened. She was now a widow, having to somehow find a way to live without her partner. Sally had to adjust to the single life fast, and to find employment as quickly as she could. The only job she was able to secure in such a short space of time was at the Crotus Prent Asylum. Nobody sought employment there unless they were in dire need, and of course, Sally had no choice. With no prior education, Sally was given the most menial and grueling tasks, working the night shift. Through the course of many years, the job in hand took its toll on Sally. The patients at this institution were verbally and physically aggressive towards her, and even as she laid there at home throughout the day after her shift, the trauma lingered in her mind. Not even sleep could take her away from the hell she found herself in, with recurring nightmares plaguing her mind. There is only so much the human condition can take before it reaches its breaking point, and Sally had finally had enough, and she began to go crazy herself. Sally had come to a swift conclusion. These people cannot be saved. They cannot be cured. She had to free them from their own minds. It was a chilly day in September, and the morning staff had arrived to find over 50 dead patients, with many of them having strangle marks around their necks, lifeless and cold in their beds. After some searching, they also found 4 dead staff members. Sally had not spared anyone. They found her in a catatonic state, crouched over and hugging her knees, slowly rocking back and forth. Her mind had completely gone. The best course of action the staff thought to take was to get her somewhere safe, from not only others, but herself. They escorted her into an ambulance, but unfortunately, it would never reach the hospital. The ambulance was found wrapped around a tree in a woodland area not too far from the asylum. The staff inside had all been murdered, and Sally was nowhere in sight. Lisa Sherwood spent most of her life in a small hamlet in the southern part of the United States. This was the kind of place where folks tended to keep to their circles, and had no care to interact with the rest of civilization or outsiders. The people of this quaint little village were always kind to her, and the elders were great believers of keeping traditions alive. The older generations have fountains of wisdom, and were the ones to keep peace and resolve issues among the village folk if any arose. Lisa took a keen interest in the charms they taught her to draw for safety and good fortune. Her grandmother would often tell her stories about these symbols and how they were imbued with connections to the spirit world. Lisa simply laughed off the superstitious fables, but little did she know they would go on to shape her entire existence. One night while returning to her village after a walk through the woodlands, the sky cast over, and before she knew it, a terrible storm had begun to loom over her. Howling winds whipped at her hair as she stumbled through the swamp, her rain-drenched dress plastered to her skin. In the slick, wet mud, she lost her footing, careening backwards and striking her head against a rock. Slipping in and out of consciousness, she was approached by dark figures that she could not identify. Her kidnappers kept her chained to the wall in a flooded cellar. Though dimly lit, she could see that she was not alone. Clearly, her fellow prisoners had been down there for some time, with large open wounds all over their bodies, swarming with flies. It took merely a day before they returned. What did they want with her and these other people? A ransom was out of the question. The poor condition of these unfortunate souls made it very unlikely. It quickly came to Lisa's attention that her captors were bloodthirsty cannibals. They took to carving chunks of meat with rusted blades, consuming the flesh down to the bone. It was apparent that these people would not survive this onslaught much longer, but Lisa was resilient. Somehow, deep within, Lisa endured weeks of torture. Starved, infected, and completely mutilated, her gaunt arms became loose in their shackles. She pulled hard, the metal tearing through skin and muscle. Lisa was free from her restraints, but still stuck in imprisonment. It wouldn't be long before she joined the rest. Delirious, she thought of home, the thought of the elders. With her dying breath, she etched the symbols they had taught her into the floor using what remained of her fingers. Almost in response, a dark hunger stirred inside her. It yearned for blood. In oath, she chose vengeance. After several months, the village's search party eventually brought them to an old shack in a swamp. Inside, its previous inhabitants had been viciously dismembered and devoured by an unidentifiable animal. In the cellar, amid rotting corpses and disconnected flesh, the elders' charms were scrolled into blood on the floor. Lisa's body was not among the bodies, and was never found. The circles among the local village grew more tight-knit than ever after that day, and they would never forget. From an early age, Herman Carter understood the human psyche. To analyse and deconstruct something as powerful as the human brain intrigued him. He was an apt pupil and gained the attention of his teachers. He excelled in high school and was published in Partisan, a psychology gazette. Within a year, Carter was fast-tracked into Yale's advanced neuroscience program and was showing signs of becoming quite a remarkable surgeon. He explored the limits of how to mend the mind, but more to his liking, how to break it. This was something that deeply fascinated Carter, and this morbid curiosity got the better of him as time went on. He was tasked by his professor and another student to take part in an experiment for the CIA at a secret government site in Illinois called Larry's Memorial Institute. The task in hand was to extract code words from willing test subjects with a roleplay of the good cop, bad cop technique. And of course, Carter fell into the latter. This role was the one he felt the most comfortable with. His old professor, Blanchard, gave him rules and limitations to these methods, but of course to Carter, these restrictions were deemed idiotic. Shouting at the test subject to extract information, to Carter this seemed futile. He knew that they weren't actually in any danger, so what was the point? One must bend the rules of ethics in the pursuit for scientific breakthroughs. Luckily for Carter, when he arrived at the facility, he was under the watchful eye of Dr. Otto Stamper, and Dr. Stamper would become Carter's new protege. Stamper implored to Carter that nothing was off the table when it came to information extraction, and this was music to Carter's ears. It's the second day of interrogation, and nobody has said a word. Carter begins to grow frustrated. He knows these guys won't talk unless they genuinely fear for their lives. Their fear was all theatrics. It was time to take it up a notch. He was going to exploit them and take away their basic human needs. Tie them up, starve and dehydrate them, deprive them of sleep. Sleep, most of all, causes people to become delirious. He could see in the men's eyes that they were not afraid. They were safe behind clauses and NDAs. Carter had to instill fear in these men one way or another, and his fellow associate was hindering real progress. He watched time and time again as his colleague tried the same rudimentary tactics as before and became enraged. Carter reached for the nearest object he could find, which happened to be a piece of wood on the floor, and swung as hard as he could at the back of his skull, striking him unconscious. This is when he saw the subjects' faces turn to abstract horror. Now with no limitations, he was free to do what he wanted with his victims. Carter ties one student to a chair, his clothes blood-stained and torn. He slowly makes an incision in the man's face and begins tearing his skin away. With each subject, Carter barely has to touch the men before they give him the code word. However, he isn't done yet. The doctor still has a few more tests to run. The nature of these kinds of experiments would surely jeopardize his career, but he could just use his colleague as a scapegoat if push came to shove. All he had to do was reprogram his mind with electroconvulsive therapy. Between electroshock therapy, the drugs being pumped through his body, and the exposure to inaudible subliminal frequencies, Carter had completely broken the man, changed his entire personality. He had become Carter's own personal Manchurian candidate, and believed the men in the room were Russian spies that had to be taken care of. He said the activation phrase, "The good doctor attacks the men." After several days of these trials, his old professor Blanchard bursts through the door with some very official-looking men and arrests Carter. Blanchard tells Carter these cuffs are just for show, and they had been recording these tests the entire time. They take him to an interrogation room where Carter signs an agreement to work for the CIA full-time. This was known as Project MK Awakening. Real spies, real prisoners, real subjects to play with. Most of those found in the company of Carter ended up dead or in vegetative states, with all types of head trauma. It was only after things grew silent and they no longer heard the screams and wails that normally came from Carter's theatre room that they began to investigate. In his office, they found the most terrible discovery of all. Dr. Stamper himself, his head peeled open, an array of electrodes and sensors inserted into his still working but annihilated brain. The government brought the end to the project, redacted the files involved, and the black site where it all took place was condemned. Not long before Anna gained the ability to walk, her mother taught her how to adapt and survive their disconnected lives in the Russian wilderness. Living in such an extremely remote and dangerous area required resourcefulness, strategy, and stoicism. They would go out every day to hunt and forage for what little food they could find, and when night fell, they would take refuge in what they called home. This was a sturdy old cabin constructed to resist the toughest winters and insulate them best they could. There was many a night where Anna would rest in her mother's arms, surrounded by the few wooden toys and masks she had crafted for her. Drifting off to sleep with stories and lullabies, she dreamt happy dreams, ignorant of the events that would soon change everything. It began like any other morning hunt. Anna and her mother were stalking a great elk through the woods. They knew it was dangerous prey, but this had been a particularly difficult winter, and the food was becoming incredibly scarce. The thought of succumbing to starvation frightened them more than any forest creature and fueled their desire to hunt. They slowly approached the animal, however it had spotted them before they could get close. Without warning, the elk reared, bellowed and charged at Anna. She was paralysed with fear as the whole world seemed to shake under the immense beast's pounding hooves. The elk was close enough for Anna to see the murderous fury in its eyes when her mother threw herself in its path, axe in hand. Anna's mother let out a blood-curdling scream as the elk impaled her upon its antlers and hoisted her into the air. With all her strength, she brought her axe down on its head again and again while it tried to shake her loose. With a sickening crack, the antlers snapped and Anna's mother was free. The beast collapsed. Anna was too small to move her mother's broken body, so she sat with her in the clearing where she had fallen. To distract her from the dying elk's cries, Anna's mother held her and hummed her favourite lullaby. They stayed like that, the huntress and the elk getting quieter and colder, until Anna was alone in the silent forest. She would have to trip back to the cabin, all by herself. Still a child, she knew just enough about life in the frozen forest to survive. She followed her instincts and became one with the wild. She got older and stronger and practiced her hunt. The more her instincts to kill became natural, the less human she became. She was just another forest creature looking to survive at that point. She widened her territory and lived off her hunts. She worked her way up through squirrels, hares, mink and foxes. Eventually she grew tired of them and hunted more dangerous animals like wolves and bears. When unsuspecting travellers came through the woods, she discovered her new favourite prey, humans. Several months passed and she'd found herself in the midst of World War I. The unlucky souls who strayed into her territory were slaughtered just like any other animal. She would bide her time and analyse them carefully, watching as the men tore each other apart. Merely light entertainment for her. The Russians would keep their enemies captive and torture them. She noticed as one man was tied to a branch and dangled under a lit fire. The shrill cries and whimpering that came from him were mocked by the soldiers. Anna too found it quite humorous, but was also puzzled by the fact they did not kill their prey first before they cooked him. The harsh winters would begin to affect the soldiers too. As night fell, she watched in horror as they slaughtered their horse for food. The inefficiency of their butchery skills particularly annoyed Anna, but she also noticed that these men would have items of interest to her. With swift and careful precision, she would take on soldiers one by one and nobody stood in her way. She moved too quick, and many of them would be paralysed by fear of just the mere sight of her. She would collect keepsakes and trinkets from the bodies of dead soldiers, colourful garments and especially toys where there were little ones. She killed everyone that stood in her way, except when she would find children. She would bring many of them back to her home, deep in the woods. They were precious, and looking at them woke up something deep in her heart. She craved the closeness of a loved one, a child of her own. Among the pillaged wooden toys, dolls and storybooks that she couldn't read, the girls would be tied by the neck with a rough and chafing rope fastened firmly to the wall. She couldn't let them wander off, or they would surely die outside. Every time, the girls would waste away and die of cold or starvation or sickness. She could never understand why. She had simply strayed so far from humanity that she never developed the maternal instinct to look after others properly. It plunged Anna into pain and sorrow and madness. She was compelled to try again, and started raiding the nearest villages to slaughter families and kidnap their daughters. She wore one of the animal masks her mother crafted for her so many years earlier to try and calm the frightened children. Villagers spread the legend of a half-beast lurking in the Red Forest, the Huntress, who killed men and ate children. The war began to escalate further, and the German soldiers were gaining ever more territory on the collapsing Russian Empire. The villagers had abandoned their homes, and no more little ones to be found, only soldiers. Many of them were found with violent axe wounds. Whole groups disappeared mysteriously. Once the war was over, the rumours of the Huntress disappeared with it, engulfed by the Red Forest. Kenneth Chase was born in 1932 by a difficult labour, one in which his mother would die as a result. The relationship with his father was turbulent right from the beginning, as he blamed him for his mother's death. As the boy grew, so did his father's resentment, consumed by alcohol addiction to numb the pain of losing his wife. By the time Kenneth was in school, him and his father had grown ever more distant. He excelled academically and showed great promise, especially in sports and physical education. He grew tall and strong, excelling at track events, but dismissed any attempts to try and encourage him into team sport activities. Jeffrey was a social outcast and shunned and brushed off any attempt to integrate him with other students. On his walk home from school, he would often find feathers on the ground, and he soon began a collection, keeping them in a cigar box under his bed. With his father either at work or in an alcohol-induced stupor, Kenneth had hours to spend alone, transfixed by the regularity of the feathers' barbs and the feeling of softness as he ran them over his lips. Watching the birds that came to the feeder in his garden, he imagined how soft they must be, and he quickly developed the idea to catch one. He integrated himself with the local dentist, soon procuring some anesthetic. Using this, he rigged up a trap on the feeder that he hoped would knock out a bird long enough so that he could touch it. After a few failed attempts, he managed to trap a robin. As it lay in his hand, he felt a sudden rush of a life at his mercy. He had planned to release it once it recovered from the anesthetic. Instead, as its eyes flickered back into consciousness and it began to struggle, his grip remained firm. His fingers slowly tightened around its throat, squeezing it until its chest feathers were finally still. He disposed of the body, keeping just a feather, with which he started a new collection, discarding the others as fake. By the late 1940s, Kenneth had left school and started working as a busboy at a local diner. He had also escalated to larger prey like squirrels, raccoons and dogs, becoming skilled at customizing the anesthetic dosage for each. The man was showing the all ever-present signs of becoming a serial killer. In early 1954, a young man went missing and the town was turned upside down in the search. A few months later, Kenneth's father, while doing some work in the crawl space underneath the house, found a cigar box. He broke it open and saw, to his horror, that it contained feathers, animal paws, and a man's finger. Returning from work, Kenneth saw his father leaving the crawl space with a cigar box in his hands. After uncovering his dark secret, he knew he could never set foot in the house again, quickly upped sticks and left. After a few weeks of living rough, he encountered a travelling circus, and with his prodigious strength, he was hired to work the ropes. To protect his livelihood and his anonymity, he acquired a new alias, Jeffrey Hawk. Suddenly surrounded by a close-knit community, Jeffrey had to learn to socialise. He donned a new personality like a disguise, quickly becoming known as charming and helpful, and was welcomed into his new family. He assimilated himself among his peers, and they were none the wiser to the true evil that lurked beneath. Over the next decade, he stayed with the circus, travelling the length and breadth of the United States. With the itinerant life providing few repercussions, he fell into bad habits. Drinks, junk food, drugs, and other pleasures of the flesh, he indulged in all of them to excess. For a time, these vices were enough, but then his old urges returned, and his nomadic existence became a cover for him to resume killing. He stole clothes and makeup from performers, fashioning a disguise that would let him get close to his victims before he anaesthetised them, bringing them back to his caravan, where they would wake to find themselves bound and at his mercy. He would finally get to have his fun, mentally and physically torturing them, their screams fueling him, before being lost in the night. Once their strength was at its lowest, he would carefully examine their fingers, searching for the prettiest, running them over his tongue to find the tastiest. Once he found the best, he would cut it from their hand and proudly add it to his collection, disposing of the rest of the body as to him it was worthless. Men, women, young, old, he didn't care. The essence of a good collection is in the variety, in the memories and the stories they evoke. He removed the costume less and less, shedding his old personality with it, fully embracing the clown, his true self. With time, he became complacent and sloppy. A victim managed to work free of her bindings while he was sleeping off the drink. She escaped, screaming for help, and he awoke to find the rest of the circus bearing down on him. He whipped his horse and the caravan and disappeared into the night. Since then, he has roamed the country, a parasite who could always be found at a carnival or circus, but who would never be seen on any playbill. He lured those brave or foolish enough to come near, trapped them and moved on before they could be found missing. Somewhere along the way, he left the ordinary roads of the United States behind him, travelling through a veil of mist and entering a new realm, one that was much better suited to the life he had chose. Rin was the only child of the Yamoka family. She was raised in the dusty halls of a traditional house in Kagawa. She studied education at Takamatsu, a private university which weighed heavily on her family's shaky finances. Her mother got ill that year and the bills started piling up. Rin worked part-time in a futile attempt to help lighten the load. Her father faced a debt that grew without end. He started working double shifts in hopes of obtaining a promotion. That's when he started losing sleep. A dark whisper would keep him awake at night, reminding him of his hopeless situation. Exhausted, he started to lose grasp of reality. Fighting to deny what the voice whispered at night, Rin's father made a desperate move. He met with his superior and explained his situation. He begged for a bonus, an advance, time off, anything. His request was denied. The company had launched a defective production line that was costing them daily. Someone had to be held accountable, and Rin's father fit the bill perfectly. He was fired after 22 years of service. That evening, Rin came home from work. She stayed late to entertain customers that lingered at a restaurant. As she parked her bike in the shed, she heard her mother's scream come from the house. She rushed in, climbing up the stairs to her parents' room. There she found bits and pieces of her mother on the floor. Her limbs were clean cut, tangled up in an unnatural position. Her breasts were sliced up, revealing her ribcage, which was cracked open. Rin gagged. A sharp katana came crashing down. Rin blocked the blade, which bit into her bare forearm. The shock of recognition interrupted her pain. Her father was wielding the katana with a stoic expression. She cried out to make him stop, but he slashed her arm again. She rushed off and slid on the blood-smeared floor. Using the door frame as support, she raised herself up. The katana ripped through the wall, cleaving her other arm. She screamed in pain as she limped into the hallway, only to be met by her father's blade. She stepped back, trembling. as she held together the soft, loose flesh of her abdomen. Images of her mother's tangled limbs flashed before her eyes. Rin charged at her father, making him stumble back. He punched her torn abdomen and she recoiled in pain. As she struggled to get back up, he slashed her thigh, making her collapse on the floor. As she crawled towards the stairs, he grabbed her hair and yanked her against a partition. The glass shattered on impact and she fell through, landing one floor down. She heard footsteps somewhere above her. With effort, she moved, worming her way into a sea of broken glass. The shards gnawed at her, ripping her flesh. He had to be stopped. He would not get away with what he'd done to her, with what he had done to her mother. Coughing up blood, her chin grazed the glass, adding to the bleeding. A low-pitched heartbeat started to ring in her ears. Her body felt so heavy she could no longer move. The ground shook with her father's footsteps. She knew she was not going to make it, but she no longer cared. She would make him pay, in this life or the next. A dark fog slowly veiled her eyes, but it could not subdue her rage. She would not rest, not yet. The darkness whispered, promising blood and revenge. Frank Morrison was 19 and had little to show for it. He stopped attending school after being kicked out of the basketball team for shoving a referee into the stands. Yet Frank was a man of potential, who could light up a room despite his bleak childhood. At 6 years old, he'd been taken away from Calgary to start a circuit of foster homes. No matter how many times he lashed out, threw tantrums and got into fights, they kept moving into new, unfamiliar houses. His last move had been 3 years prior when his last foster dad, Clive Andrews, had picked him up from the adoption centre. They'd been on the road for 7 hours before reaching a small bungalow in Ormond. It would be the longest time they'd spent together. Clive was too busy trading checks from family services for drinks at the bar. Ormond was a small, stable place, a remote town of 6,000 inhabitants where grey winters drag on for most of the year. Frank did everything he could to get into another adoptive family, but he changed his mind when he caught the attention of Julie, a beautiful girl who was convinced that she deserved better than a life in Ormond, and Frank, as an outsider, was her ticket out. Frank attended the parties she threw where everyone was younger than him and easily impressed, which he liked. He met the impulsive Joey, who liked to show off, and the shy, naive Susie, who was Julie's best friend. They would hang out on an abandoned lodge up Mount Ormond. Their time together was the perfect break from the boring conformity of their small, insignificant everyday lives. Frank saw it as an opportunity to shape the lack of experience into something powerful. He lined up nights of debauchery and rampage, testing their limits. Bullying, vandalism, and theft were essentially their weekend plans. Frank became the clear ringleader of the group, and it came to a point where they would do anything he asked. Nothing was off limits when they put their masks on. They snuck inside easily enough, as the building was supposed to be empty after closing hours, but a cleaner who was still in there grabbed Julie as soon as she came near. Hearing her stifled cries, a dark impulse took over Frank. He rushed to her aid, knife in hand, and without hesitating, planted the blade into the cleaner's back. As the group stared at Frank in shock, he ordered them to finish the job. Joey clenched his jaw, grabbed the knife, and stabbed the bleeding man in the ribs. Susie didn't want to do it. Frank shouted at her. They had to finish what they started. They were all complicit now. Julie closed her eyes and slid the knife into the man's chest. She handed the wet blade to Susie. They were all in this together now. Susie stared at Julie in disbelief as Frank grabbed her trembling hands and inserted the knife deep into the man's throat. Frank told them to move fast. They mopped the blood off the floor, stashed the body in the trunk of Joey's car, and drove up to Mount Ormond. All four were digging in the muddy snow to dispose of the body when Frank spotted something moving through the woods. He grabbed his knife and broke from the group to check it out. The fog thickened around Frank, becoming so dense that he soon could no longer see ahead. He retraced his steps and stumbled into an ominous trail. He followed the eerie path, as if called by the darkness. Julie, Susie and Joey finished digging, but Frank was nowhere to be seen. Julie spotted his muddy footsteps in the snow, and the three of them followed the trail, which took them deeper into the woods. When Julie, Susie and Joey did not return home that night, their parents thought they'd run away with Frank. Each family came up with a different theory. The mood in the town changed, however, when a body was found by an abandoned lodge up Mount Ormond. When she was 5 years old, Idris, the youngest of a family of 7, was left on the brick-red burning steps of the Temple of Purgation at the centre of Babylon. To process her shock and sorrow, she held on to the belief that the gods had a plan for her. Her new life was one of quiet servitude. She would tend to the gardens, prepare ceremonial meals, and polish ceremonial incense burners. At night, she would pray for a sign that would reveal her purpose. When she came of age, she attended the high-ranking priest during the yearly worshipping of the sea gods, the god of water and creation. Swinging a censer down the great hypostyle hall, she cast thick black fumes that reached the cold towering stone pillars before dissipating. Her worries lifted, and the resulting bliss made her feel closer to the gods than ever. She worked herself to the bone each day that followed, fulfilling her duties while taking on new ones, as she aided the priests during purification rituals. The priests were more and more in need of assistance. Cleansings were being performed daily to answer the demand from outside the high temple walls, where a catastrophic plague had resurfaced. Within months, the priests contracted the disease. It did not take long before they became too weak to perform any kind of ritual. Adiris, having assisted many purification rituals, was the only one able to carry on. The swelling panic had to be contained, even if by a novice. Anxious before her first ceremony, Adiris visited the priest's sanctuary chamber. When she lit the candles, she noticed a narrow opening at the back. Sliding through the gap, she'd reached a crypt hidden under the sanctuary. The chamber was bare except for the golden statue of a woman, who stood with outstretched hands, her fingers covered in jewels. It was the sign Adiris had been waiting for. The great hall was packed with followers who bowed down as Adiris entered. She strode to the brick altar and grabbed a ceremonial dagger forged in silver, her ruby-ringed fingers wrapping around the blade like claws. The sudden display of luxury intrigued the followers, who were struck already by her youth and beauty. As she began reciting the epic of creation, a woman at the back swooned and collapsed. Adiris rushed to her and noticed the black blisters covering her feet. Without hesitation, Adiris grabbed her sacred blade and swung it at her own foot, severing a toe. Then she offered the bloody part to the gods, asking them to protect the woman. A silence fell over the followers, who revered Adiris as their new priestess. Tales of her wealth, beauty, and devotion began to spread across the city as quickly as the disease. Soon, Adiris' followers called her the High Priestess of Babylon. But her faith was tried when she showed the first signs of infection. Her cough became a mix of phlegm and blood, her neck erupted in abscesses, and her four-toed foot darkened. Ashamed of her condition, she began wearing a veiled headpiece and carried a censer that masked the rancid smell of sick that clung to her skin. Hoping to be saved, she kept performing the rituals, offering blessed water and food to her followers. But no ritual could save her. In a desperate attempt to appease the gods, Adiris banished herself from the city. She travelled north with a few followers, venturing through the cold woodlands of Arashtu until it was no longer possible to walk. They camped in a damp cave, where Adiris lay in a pool of vomit. Her foot, which had turned black, was so swollen that she could not go any further. Her followers and she realised the truth in that cave. They were all infected with the plague. Kneeling among her retching followers, Adiris made one last prayer. The black fumes of incense rose into the damp air before being wiped off by a cold breeze. Neither the body of Adiris nor those of her followers were ever found. Many told tales of her return, but no one truly knew what fate had befallen the High Priestess of Babylon. Honouring his family's name was never enough for Kazan Yamoka. He wanted to surpass his father's reputation and end what he saw as the thinning of samurai culture, with farmers often posing as samurai. His father tried to turn Kazan's attention to more noble pursuits, but Kazan refused to heed his advice, and borrowing his father's katana, he embarked a dark pilgrimage to prove his worth and rid Japan of impostors. Ignoring the code that had been taught to him, Kazan killed impostors in the hills and the valleys, on the beaches and in the woodlands. The killings were brutal, cruel and morbid. He humiliated farmers and warriors alike, yanking off their top knots and stripping them of their armour. His rage, bloodlust and perverse sense of honour knew no bounds. Monks believed he was possessed by something dark and otherworldly and cursed him, while a noble lord began to call him Oni Yamoka, the rageful samurai, an insult to both Kazan and his family. Determined to redeem his family's name, Kazan now butchered anyone who dared to call him Oni Yamoka. The insult confused him. He had defeated the best and had purified the samurai class by ridding the land of impostors. How could anyone refer to him as an ogre? Had it been because he'd marched onto a battlefield to cut down the fiercest warriors? Had it been because he had taken a cannonball and dashed hundreds of skulls with it? Or had it been because of his need to secure a trophy from his victims? It didn't matter. Being called an ogre was more than he could bear, and an ominous voice in his head urged him to strike down the lord who had desecrated his name. As Kazan made for the lord's town, he suddenly found himself face to face with the samurai standing on a dirt road, blocking his way. Kazan readied his cannonball. Without a word, the samurai attacked quickly and secured the upper hand, but he hesitated. With a devastating blow, Kazan crushed the samurai's head and cracked his helmet. As Kazan approached the fallen samurai, he saw his father's face and staggered back to his haunches. His father stared at Kazan with mingled shame and regret as he issued his last breath. Kazan closed his eyes and screamed in agony until he could scream no more. When he opened his eyes again, his father was gone. Not only had he killed his father, but he had allowed thieves to steal his body for armour. Bitter, lost and disillusioned, Kazan roamed the land aimlessly with his father's voice rattling in his head, taunting him, reminding him of his failures, sending him into fits of uncontrollable rage. One day, walking in the woods, Kazan happened upon an Oni statue. He stopped and stood motionless for a long moment. The weathered and overgrown statue seemed to be ridiculing him, accusing him of being the imposter samurai he had so desperately sought to destroy. Kazan shook the laughing voice out of his head and half remembered the lord who had ridiculed him as Oni Yamoka. With renewed anger, Kazan journeyed to a high-up town in the snowy mountains where the lord resided. A dozen samurai met Kazan at the gates of the town. He quickly displaced all of them in a moment's notice. His speed and strength were unmatched. His rage was incomprehensible. Covered in blood and gore, Kazan battled through the town and soon found the lord hiding in a villa. He dragged him out of a cabinet, sliced his tendons to immobilize him, and watched him beg and squirm like a dog. Without hesitation, he thrust his fist into the lord's mouth and yanked out the wicked tongue that had desecrated his name. Satisfied, Kazan exited the villa to find himself surrounded by dozens of farmers wielding rusted scythes, sharp pitchforks and heavy clubs. He survived the first few assaults, but there were too many attackers coming from every direction. Within moments, Kazan was on the ground staring at a cold, indifferent, darkening sky, as farmers took turns stabbing and torturing the Oni, who had butchered their beloved lord. The frenzied mob dragged Kazan into a small stone mill to continue the torture, and finally left him to die a slow, agonizing death. When they returned, the mill was filled with a strange black fog, and Kazan's body and the Kanabo were nowhere to be found. It was the beginning of a dark legend about a rageful Oni haunting the town. Born in the dust-ridden badlands of the American Midwest, Caleb Quinn was son to struggling Irish immigrants. On the edge of the frontier, sickness, famine and death were common sights, and pioneers contended for whatever scraps they could claim while tycoons feasted. Caleb's father, once an engineer, had few options to ply his trade, as business posted a common sign: no Irish need apply. His antiquated tools laid untouched for years until Caleb uncovered them. Noticing his son's interest in the trade, he gifted him his old wrench. The devices Caleb made under his father's guidance had quaint applications, but when his father was away, they took a grim turn. He hid plans for a mask that would gouge barbed needles into a human's eyes and rip them from their sockets, complete with sketches of it fitted on boys who bullied him. With age, Caleb's engineering abilities became marketable, and employers put their discrimination aside. Henry Bayshaw, the owner of the United West Rail, hired him. Caleb first invented a gun that shot railroad spikes into the ground. Next, he made a steam-powered tunneling drill. But as Bayshaw feigned indifference, the devices began turning up at other companies, the patents stolen from Caleb and sold. A familiar sensation coursed through Caleb's blood, feeding the sharp pain in his heart. Rage overwhelming him, he burst into Bayshaw's office and smashed his face into a bloody stew. As he was pulled away, he pushed his specialized gun into his boss's gut and squeezed the trigger. A railroad spike plowed through his skin and viscera, nailing Bayshaw to his desk. The only thing that saved Caleb from hanging was Bayshaw's unlikely survival. That's definitely not attempted murder or anything, but whatever. For 15 years, Caleb was confined to Hellshire Penitentiary, the nation's first private prison. In a fortress of illiterate convicts, he found an unlikely friend in the educated prison warden. He designed torture devices for him and in return received extra meals. After a time, the warden offered to commute his sentence. He spoke of something greater than monetary wealth, political capital, and that the connections could have Bayshaw framed and rotting behind bars for life. He had only one request: make him rich, fill the prison, use ingenuity to bring outlaws in alive. Caleb returned to his workshop, and with a few modifications emerged with something new: the spear gun. The first trial occurred when a thief robbed a Chinese laundry. Seizing on the opportunity, Caleb unleashed his prototype. Metal joints screeched as a spike shot forward, gouging into the target's abdomen. But as the spear tugged, it caught in the thief's intestines and with an ungodly sound, yanked them onto the dusty road. After several iterations, the disembowelments dwindled, but Caleb had already earned his new nickname, the Death Slinger. Looking to protect his asset, the prison warden pulled strings and released Irish inmates to form Caleb's posse. The Hellshire Gang was born. For 6 years, they roamed the country, collecting wanted outlaws for the prison, fulfilling their end of the bargain. After a bloody battle at Glenvale, Caleb caught notice of a newspaper headline: Henry Bayshaw purchases Hellshire Penitentiary. In the picture, a disfigured Bayshaw proudly shook the warden's hand. Caleb's heart pounded with rage, blood swelling as if it would burst from his veins. He had been sold out, a pawn in a rich man's game. The Hellshire Gang pledged their loyalty to Caleb and called for the warden's head. In a thundering gallop, they smashed through the prison entrance, shrieking like bloodthirsty marauders. A guard raised his pistol, but hesitated. A spear punctured his chest. Caleb grabbed the man's head and slammed it against the prison cell until it spilled through the bars. Holy shit, this man's not fucking around. Reaching the warden's office, Caleb kicked the door and was met with a fortunate sight. It wasn't only the prison warden who cowered in a corner, but Henry Bayshaw. Caleb rushed to Bayshaw, beating, bludgeoning, tearing at his flesh. The man's blood dripped from his face, crimson pooling at his feet. The Hellshire Gang swarmed the warden, snapping bones with each kick. With the two men broken and begging for death, the posse dragged them to the commons, where they were left to the growing crowd of prisoners. Soaked in blood and sweat, Caleb hobbled to his old cell, hardly paying notice to Bayshaw's screams. He sat on the bed's edge as drops of blood ran from his fingertips. A thick, unnatural fog streamed through the barred window. He pulled out his old wrench, cracked and rusted, and ran a thumb along the metal, regarding it with faded eyes. He couldn't remember when it came into his possession. At his feet, he saw a dusty path. At its end, silhouettes of all who had done him wrong. The boys who'd bullied him, the executives who took advantage of him, and again, Henry Bayshaw. Emerging from a fog with the tools to dispose of them, unforgiving steel hooks, brilliant and beautiful in their simplicity. Pain tore through his leg as he stood, but he endured, pushing onwards, walking the dusty path, leaving a trail of blood flowing behind him. To understand the human condition, one must rise above it. This was the credo of Talbot Grimes, a Scottish chemist whose unrestrained ambition took him to towering heights. As a boy, he was a popular child, bright, charismatic, and unafraid to challenge authority. Yet despite his social graces, he was fiercely independent, spending much of his time exploring the sprawling fields near his town alone. What began as a child's curiosity nearly turned deadly after experimenting with a patch of poisonous foxglove. For days he laid in bed dripping with sweat, purging any food that touched his stomach. When he recovered, it wasn't fear that gripped him, but fascination. There was something magical in how a single flower could so drastically affect him. Into his adult years, his ambition developed as quickly as his questionable methods. He attended the London School of Medicine and excelled despite several reprimands. His willingness to push the limits secured him into a position with the British East India Company, and within 7 years he was made head chemist. In time, he completed one of his greatest achievements, a chemical that could increase a worker's productivity while reducing their need for rest. He was rewarded with a secret laboratory beneath a prison camp on Dyer Island. Off the coast of India, prisoners from the Opium War became his unwilling subjects, leading to a drug that allowed soldiers to withstand incredible amounts of pain. Though most side effects were few and far between, there were rumours that a small number of soldiers went mad. In feral states, they massacred villages, impaling the populace on bayonets, leaving them hanging from trees. There was no official reports on the subject, and Talbot refused to believe himself what could only be exaggerated war stories. Though his callous brilliance seemed impervious to scrutiny, he was ignorant to the enemies his questionable work had amassed. The realization struck him quite literally. With a steel pipe to the back of his head during a trip to Mangalore, he was bound and loaded into a wagon. When his blindfold was removed, a sickly man showed him a mass grave filled with hundreds of bodies. Unbeknownst to Talbot, his productivity-increasing drug had killed nearly an entire factory's worth of workers. He knew he couldn't defend himself against the anger and accusations of his abductor. All he could do was curl up as the blows from the steel pipe rained down. His body was thrown into a grave and left for dead. Slipping in and out of consciousness, he crawled for an escape, fingers sinking into rotting flesh. Black flies feasted on his uncovered skin, the sensation of 100 pinpricks stabbing into him. As he collapsed, he came face to face with the dead woman's dazzling hazel eyes. Too weak to pull away, he could do nothing but witness his life's work. Then, from the edge of death, he was brought back. He found himself on a small bed as a kindly, wrinkled face looked over him. With each pained breath, he was nursed back to health in an ancient mystery school posing as a monastery. In verdant gardens behind tall, unassuming walls, monks studied forbidden texts, striving to expand the human mind in the search for other dimensions, believing one to be connected to the other. Talbot's knowledge proved indispensable, his mind-altering chemicals integrating seamlessly with theories of neural expansion. He realised then that his salvation was no coincidence. He was plucked from the pit specifically to advance the school's knowledge. He agreed to help until his recovery was complete, being tasked with researching what the monks called the soul chemical, a compound derived from the pineal gland that could open the mind's eye. What began as a favour to his saviours soon became an obsession. Poring over the school's archives of lost text, he uncovered scientific formulas that confirmed previously unthinkable ideas. He dreamt of ushering humankind into a new period of enlightenment. Perhaps then, the nightmares of hundreds of dead factory workers and of those two hazel eyes would fade from his mind. As he came closer to a breakthrough, the demeanour of the monk shifted. The gentle smiles they offered were paired with uneasy eyes that quickly darted away when spotted. The polite conversations he was once privy to turned to hushed murmurs. The last thing he would see of the school was the cracked ceiling above his head, branching like a dendrite through plaster. His next memories were a shattered mosaic of images and sensations, smearing lights, horse hooves on cobblestone, coarse burlap scratching at his cheeks, and sharp bites into his arm. He awoke ragged and unwashed, splayed on the straw mattress of an opium den. Mind in a dense fog, his first thought was of his notes, the only record of his groundbreaking revelations. He searched frantically, scrambling through the dingy basement, pleading aloud for help. The few other denizens looked up from their hammocks, offering nothing but drug-soaked eyes and apathetic gazes that soon fell into half-slumber. Before he noticed the robed figure appear behind him, a needle plunged into his arm, and the world disappeared once more. Awoken, again, each time hazier than the last. He tongued at the hollow gaps between his teeth. How long, he wondered. A faint memory returned. The soul chemical, his notes, the verge of a breakthrough. A faraway whisper entered his mind. He fumbled with a stone, sharpening it with shaking hands. In the dim light of the den, amongst the catatonic occupants, he carved his research from memory into the walls. He wrote for hours until his fingers bled. He scribbled endlessly until there was no room left on the walls, having to resort to writing on the floor instead. He took in everything the voice whispered despite his inability to comprehend it. When there was nowhere left to write, he gripped the stone and carved the message into his chest. Stained with blood, he witnessed a miracle appear before him, a magnificent field of lush orange flowers. For a moment, Talbot felt the sense of wonder he possessed as a child. The junkies of the opium den awoke to silence, the dry scent of smoke still lingering in the air. Shambling out of their drug-hazed fog, they found the stone floor wet with blood, tiny rivulets coursing through the cracks. As eyes adjusted to the darkened room, the jagged lettering scrawled across its length began to appear, written over and over again without end, but there was one single line: "Death is only the beginning." Talbot joined the entity and began his research on the pustula serum, a nectar produced by the pustula flowers, which bloom in the entity's yearly blight. He researched the effects of the pustula serum by testing it on other killers, seeking to learn about this world and the entity. When the entity had Talbot become a killer, Talbot refused, and so the entity tossed him into the void, where people go when they are no longer useful to the entity. However, Talbot found a pustula flower within the void, and remembering his research, injected himself with the pustula serum to have enough strength to stay alive. Talbot began to go mad within the void, his memories foggy and shattered, craving home, and more importantly, craving more pustula serum. In desperation, he succumbs to the entity's will. One flower. Talbot would rip apart survivor and killer alike just for one flower, and the entity accepted. However, refusing to listen to the entity warrants physical alterations. When Talbot took his first vial of serum in his new life, the entity transformed him into what he was already becoming, a monster, corrupted by the pustula serum. Talbot Grimes was blinded by his ambition. He sought to understand this realm, the entity, and perhaps use its powers to explore other worlds and understand those as well. In his time in the void, his last maddened thoughts were wishes he could return home, but not even death is an escape from the entity. A pair of conjoined twins, Charlotte and Victor Dier formed an emotional bond like none other. The unlikeliness of their successful birth in the 17th century could be described as miraculous, yet he immediately brought about their life of persecution. The twins emerged with Victor's lower body affixed to the chest of his sister, legs twisted around her muscles and organs. He was smaller than Charlotte, grown as if he were an appendage of her body rather than a fully formed boy. As the newborn screeched, so too did the midwife who delivered them, running from the home, yelling of a demon birthed by a witch. So began the hunting of Charlotte, Victor, and their mother Madeline. The coming years were fleeting memories for the twins, yet they were the closest thing to a normal life they would know. The journey with their mother was what they believed all children underwent, the games of running and hiding through France's countryside being an ordinary occurrence. At the age of 5, a new challenge to the game was presented as their mother fell ill. Pale and exhausted, Madeline had no choice but to pass responsibility of collecting food onto Charlotte. The girl, burdened under extra clothing that concealed Victor's protruding body, set out from their forest tent and marched to the nearby town. Though a peculiar sight, she did what she had been trained for, waiting for an opening at the market and swiping whatever food she could. There was a victory in the game, but one short-lived. After midnight, glowing flames surrounded the family's encampment, bobbing through the darkness. A single commanding shout broke the night's silence, and a mob of witch hunters streamed in. Grubby hands tore the twins from their bed, Charlotte frantically kicking all who approached. Madeline cried for her children, her voice abruptly silenced by a club to her skull. Victor shrieked, the wailing of a trapped rat. The hunters coordinated quickly. A judge and hand declared Madeline guilty of witchcraft, evidenced by her demon spawn. Within minutes, they shackled her unconscious body to a tree, surrounding her feet with dry twigs and moss. As she awoke, she did not struggle, only begged for her children to turn away. They would be given no choice. The twins were forced to watch as the torch was lit, and they watched as flames leapt at their mother's skirt, charring and sizzling her flesh. They watched as fat dripped from her body and her face bubbled and twisted. They watched until the screams that tore her vocal cords were no more, and all that was left was the crackling of embers and a nauseating stench. Whatever joy and goodness were in them died with their mother. Caged and transported to an old wooden temple, they were sold to a secretive group clad in dark cloaks. Victor reacted with the ferocity of a rabid beast at any who approached, clawing and biting. The only solace that could claim him was the embrace of his sister. Charlotte, bitter and hateful to all but her brother, found purpose in being his protector. Within the temple, they were exposed to unusual experiments, some cruel, many simply baffling. One day they would be made to break the neck of a small bird, the next, they would bleed their fingers into a vase of roses. Every 7th day, they would sleep with a branch of a damp oak beneath their pillow. Then there was the chanting, a never-ending chorus from the cloaked figures on scheduled intervals. In time, a final experiment was planned. 2 robed figures herded the twins to the centre of the temple, holding Charlotte upon an altar in a room lit with candelabras. The wrinkled face of a man peered from under his hood, placing a hand on the forehead of each twin, making careful examinations of their skulls. Memento mori, he uttered, as he withdrew a shining blade. Charlotte rolled to her side, shifting her brother off the altar. With a screech, he stretched his arm as far as he could, knocking a candelabra to the ground. The flames tugged to the dry wood immediately. They swept over the floor, igniting the black robes that brushed against it. Screams of agony pierced the chaos, invigorating Charlotte. She dashed through the inferno, vision concealed with nothing but black smoke and blazing flame. A painful heaviness filled her lungs. No exit could be found, every step leading to overwhelming heat. She fell to her knees, suffocating, and then she saw it. Sunlight, trees. She stumbled from the fire into dewy grass. Without looking back, she ran into the forest until she collapsed. When Charlotte opened her eyes, she reached for Victor's hand. He made no attempt to budge. His body hung helplessly from her torso. She clasped his face, stared into his sad, still eyes. The movements she was accustomed to, his body pulling at her skin, his legs prodding at the cavity in her chest, were no more. Victor was dead. Charlotte had no choice but to continue moving as she mourned, fearing black cloaks and witch hunters were prowling. She concealed her brother's corpse under her clothing and marched for the sewers of a nearby city. There, she set up camp, emerging often to steal whatever she could, resorting to raiding barns for pig slop whenever desperation set in. Throughout the years, Victor's corpse rotted as limbs oozed and blackened, yet his body demonstrated resistance to complete decomposition, as if his sister's blood still coursed through him. Protecting his lifeless body became Charlotte's sole reason for being, refusing to ever be separated from the only family she had left. Life into her teenage years was a game of survival. Her hatred for humanity grew each day under the realization that they would never leave her be. No matter how many died during her botched robberies and desperate attempts to escape, there would always be more to pursue and sling words of condemnation at her. Monster, demon, witch, and it was the Black Cloaks who were the worst of them. The hunt for her was unending, forcing her to constantly abandon shelter and run. For years, Charlotte fled, drawing blood out of necessity, trailing her long-dead brother in the night. During a frigid winter, her body began to break down. Food was scarce, and the refuge of rickety shacks were no use against freezing temperatures. Sickle in hand, she sheltered near a campfire in the woods, not knowing if the Black Cloaks would take her before the cold did. As frost crystallized around her nostrils and her lips took on a gentle blue hue, Charlotte felt something she had never experienced: acceptance. She closed her eyes, opening herself to the serenity of death when a shriek shrill and vicious pierced her ears. Victor spasmed and flailed from her chest, a cloud of fog encompassing him. Before she could react, he spilled from her in a bloody puddle, landing on the snow and running. Pulling herself from the edge of death, she gave chase. Calling his name, she ran through the forest until her legs could hardly carry her, until finally, within her view, was Victor, sitting at the edge of a thick fog. His face, twisted and feral, screamed as a dark hooded figure emerged from the fog, grabbed his arm and seized him. The serenity that had crept into Charlotte was extinguished, replaced with the seething hatred and rage she had depended on for so long. With a tight grip of her sickle, she charged into the fog, prepared to eviscerate any who set foot near her brother. And yet to this day, every time we face the twins in the fog, we can take comfort in the fact that we can kick him in the face. Jiwoon Hak thrived under the attention of others, energized by every eye that watched him and every tongue that spoke his name. Amidst the prestige, he had only one desire: more. Even as a child, he found ways to draw crowds. Working at his family's restaurant, he attracted business with spectacles he performed using throwing knives. Gullible tourists believed this was a traditional South Korean experience, gladly parting with their money to witness it. Jiwoon's father spent the restaurant earnings on dancing and vocal lessons for his son, pushing him to attain the fame he never could. So basically, he was a textbook narcissist, and his father lived vicariously through him. Jiwoon did not disappoint. After years showcasing his abilities to nobodies at talent shows, he hit the track to stardom. Yoonjin Lee, a producer at Mighty One Entertainment, recruited Jiwoon into a training program. He transferred to a dormitory in Seoul where for 14 hours a day he was crafted into a star, taught how to move and sing, how to carry himself with the right balance of confidence and modesty. Draining as this process was, it worked. Yoonjin selected Jiwoon to join the band No Spin, bringing a raw energy to their tracks. Fame was almost immediate. Jiwoon lived in a daze of interviews and adoration, and though the frenzied schedule exhausted his bandmates, he was invigorated. Each day was an affirmation that he was greater than the mediocrity society spewed out. But over time, the champagne grew stale. When he looked at his fans, he saw their joint envy split 5 ways. thinned out between each band member. The validation that had surged through him left a desperate yearning for more. Ji-woon kept up impressions, mimicking a charm long buried under loathing. He recorded the latest No Spin album with his bandmates, never missing a beat. After a lengthy lunch break, he returned to the studio to discover fate had granted him a gift. The scent of burning wires was unmistakable. He rushed to the control room, finding the door blocked by fallen speakers. On the other side, his bandmates pounded on the door, their cries accompanied by the crackling of flames. Ji-woon called to them, dashing to the speakers, grabbing one and stopping. He froze. Each breath was a conscious, deliberate process requiring all his attention. The nearby cries hardly audible until slowly he backed away. And then he heard it. They were screaming for his name as they burned, screaming for him to save them. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. When the fire crew arrived, his tears were genuine. Ji-woon was celebrated as a tragic figure, a hero who did all he could in a futile attempt to save his friends. Yeonjin paraded him through interviews until it was time to rebrand. He was reborn as the Trickster, a solo artist who produced his own songs, sporting a soft heart beneath a wild exterior. But away from the concert setups and television stages, something darker grew. He targeted those who lived alone, coming to them in the night. The first was a college music student with a captivating voice. Ji-woon walking with a baseball bat to the skull, binding his arms and legs, gagging him with a rag duct taped to his mouth. He tortured him for hours, dissecting him alive. Yet there was something missing. A sound, a connection. He wanted to hear the victim's wondrous voice pleading as he cut his belly open, but all he received was muffled cries to a rag. He learnt and adjusted. Victims had to be abducted, driven to abandoned buildings where he could let their voices carry unrestrained emotion. He made music from them, prodding the right places to evoke different types of shrieks and howls. Stabbing the quadratus lumborum elicited a long, guttural wail, while slashing the carotid artery created a sound like a cat being strangled. There was honesty in their suffering. Ji-woon recorded each session, synthesizing and working them into songs, hiding them behind layers of melodies. He was elated with his work. He left hints for police, arranging a mink boa from a recent photoshoot around a victim's slashed throat. For his next killing, he removed the teeth of the man that a boxer in one of his music videos was about. During a particularly audacious plea for attention, he killed a fan that had met during a VIP meetup, replacing her eyes with diamond cufflinks and writing "I have seen God" in blood across her chest. Each scene was a dazzling spectacle. Between music and murder, Ji-woon's work was discussed globally. However, as violence became his preferred art style, his music career took a hit. Revenue was down, and Mighty One executives pointed their fingers at him. Yeonjin, with professional fury, came to his defense, but she was outnumbered. It was decided that Ji-woon could no longer self-produce his songs. The decision was devastating. His tracks fused genuine humanity into music, yet executives rejected anything that wasn't generic and expected. And so be it. If they couldn't understand his art, he would incorporate them into it until they did. He had 3 months until he was able to perform a private show for Mighty One's board members. 3 months to plan his magnum opus. He transferred obscene amounts of money to a veterinarian in exchange for canisters of nitrous oxide, then bribed the stage technician of Mighty One's private theatre for access to the room. His celebrity granted him a benefit of the doubt no regular person could conceive. When the show was ready, gas seeped into the room as executives and stagehands awaited Ji-woon, conveniently running behind schedule. When he arrived, half-conscious bodies were splayed in their seats and crawling across the floor. He worked quickly, binding everyone, pausing only when he came to Yeonjin, the woman who had plucked him from a mud hole and set him on the path he deserved. She would be rewarded, granted special access to the coming display of wonder. Even under sedation, she fought a raging storm within her, far stronger than the others. He propped her up as the lone audience member, prying her eyes open. The others, snivelling and sobbing, were brought on stage to perform their final act. With a contemptible sneer, he slapped makeup onto their faces and shone stage lights upon them. They became his instruments. To the sound of self-produced melodies, he tortured them, gracefully dashing from one body to another, conducting an operatic crescendo from their wailings. They shouted, whimpered, screamed, cried for their loved ones, cried for their mothers. It was a magnificent outpouring of emotion, of what it meant to be human, and what they did with eyes fixed on Ji-woon. Viscera drained from the stage until, with the toss of a throwing knife, the final human instrument fell silent and the music stopped. Covered in sweat and blood, an exhausted Ji-woon looked to Yeonjin and bowed. Curtain call. He had attained perfection. With blade in hand, he made his way to Yeonjin, prepared to tie up loose ends before the credits rolled, but as he reached her, the fog. From where, he didn't know, but it billowed around them, damp, cool, comfortable. He saw the grand stage, hospitals and temples, forests and slaughterhouses, an eternal plain adorned with rusted hooks, sustained by the million eyes that would watch him, run from him, experience him. All he had to do was accept, become an implement of the fog, and, most importantly, make them free. Carmina Mora was a gifted artist who carried the guilt of her young brother's death. Growing up in a rugged coastal village in southern Chile, she sketched the sublime landscapes of Patagonia. Sitting outside, she painted dramatic fjords while feeding the crows nested in the tree next to the house. She grew up motherless, as she would depart from her when she was very young. Her father blamed Carmina for her mother's abandonment, which added to her grief. She became the caretaker of Matthias, her little brother, despite still being a child herself. A year later, Carmina was painting with Matthias outside when the telephone rang. Her father remained in the yard, drinking his beer. Carmina rushed to the house to answer the phone and hung up a few seconds later. When she returned outside, Matthias was nowhere to be seen. She asked her father, but he had paid no attention to Matthias. She called her brother's name, looking for him everywhere. While searching, she saw a bright red coat floating on the narrow creek by the house. Matthias's jacket. She jumped into the creek and found him floating on the surface with vacant eyes and blinking. He had fallen and drowned. Her scream tore the sky. Her father found Carmina sobbing on the creek shore, clutching her brother's body in her arms, surrounded by a murder of crows. Her father snatched Matthias's body away from her, and she cried until her voice broke. The following morning, her world was cloaked in darkness. Her father did not say a word, because he didn't have to. Carmina knew it was all her fault. Months passed, yet her loss was as fresh as morning dew. Crippled with self-loathing, she could no longer paint. Without Matthias, life had no meaning. On the bleak morning of Matthias's birthday, Carmina walked to a narrow bridge several blocks away from her home. She was convinced that nothing could bring her relief. Her mother was gone, her brother was dead, and her father blamed her all for it. She was convinced that she had nothing left to live for. Carmina walked to the railing of the bridge that stood over the turbulent river. Locals had nicknamed the spot Death Leap. Several cars drove by Carmina, but none stopped. No one seemed to care. She climbed over the railing and her legs wobbled as she stood over the lip of the bridge. She looked down, watching the fierce river smash into a giant boulder. She closed her eyes. Suddenly, a cacophony of calls filled the sky. Carmina opened her eyes and saw a black cloud of feathers flying towards her. The cloud split open and glossy black crows dove from the sky. One landed on Carmina's shoulder and stared intently into her eyes, as if peering into her soul. Her grip on the railing loosened and the crow cawed raucously. Carmina stared at the crow, confused. Another crow landed on the railing, then another. Soon, a flock of crows were covering the railing of the bridge, staying close to her. She felt the heavy stare on her, calculative and enigmatic, as if they were assessing her. She looked down for a second and a thunder of calls interrupted her dark impulse. The crows seemed to care about her well-being. As she dangled over the edge with the wind blowing through her raven hair, Carmina felt akin to them. For the first time since Matthias had died, Carmina did not feel alone. She returned home, giving life another chance. The crows left, but Carmina suspected that if anything happened to her, they would return. Inspired by her ordeal, Carmina picked up a brush. In the weeks that followed, she painted her experience, using black ink to depict the death leap with the black cloud of feathers, the murder of crows that saved her life. The experience was transformative and launched her signature black ink surrealist art. After several years, some colour pierced the darkness, and this shift of medium expanded her art form. She painted large-scale murals on busy street corners, designed grandiose costumes, and recited militant poetry. Carmina's art displayed local, intimate tragedies on a large scale, making them impossible to ignore, and everywhere she performed, crows followed. Her performances grew bold and drew the attention of artists who found her style invigorating. She grew close to a group of painters who understood her iconoclastic vision. Her performances launched the large-scale surrealist movement, which became a phenomenon. Her renown grew enough to attract the commission of a multinational enterprise, the VAC label. Carmina investigated the group, discovering that they gifted art pieces to select disreputable congressmen. VAC's commissioned artists seemed to disappear afterward. Determined to expose the group's link to corrupt politics, Carmina accepted VAC's commission. The following week, Carmina painted a giant mural on the cemetery's columbarium, displaying the VAC label logo as a surrealist Grim Reaper, harvesting the fields of Chilean families. She wore a theatrical dress as she painted, on which she had stitched a poem about political revolution. The piece sparked a radical debate about corruption. The controversy painted a target on Carmina's back. After receiving anonymous death threats, she took refuge in her father's house, bringing along her closest friends for safety. That night, a gang of masked gunmen broke into the house. They swiftly subdued Carmen and her friends, threw them in a van, and drove off. The following morning, a dry breeze blew sand on Carmina's face, awakening her. She was seated in a chair in the middle of a desert, with her legs tied and her hands handcuffed. Her friends were lying on the ground, tied up. A shadow fell over her face. Carmina looked up. He grabbed her hands and recited a hymn in an unfamiliar language. Carmina held his gaze. He paused and brought down his blade with a sudden blow. She cried in agony as her friends awoke to a terrible sight, Carmina's severed hands falling in the sand. The hooded man smiled in satisfaction. "How are you going to paint now?" Carmina cursed and screamed at him, wriggling against the bonds on her legs. The man grabbed Carmina's chin. She spit in his face. He grunted and pried her mouth open, pulling out her tongue. Carmina struggled in his hold. In a violent blow, he chopped off Carmina's tongue. She howled in anguish. The man wiped his blade on the robe, leaving a trail of blood. How are you going to recite poems now? Sorrow swelled in Carmina's chest, sharper than pain. Overwhelmed by uncontrollable rage, grief, and loss overcame her senses. She had lost her little brother, and she had lost the only way to cope with such pain. Carmina screamed like on the day her brother died. Raucous calls echoed through the wasteland. The sky was obscured by a cyclone, dark clouds. Black feathers fell on Carmina's bleeding arms. She looked up and saw a torrent of crows erupting from the clouds, diving in on the hooded man. As the ravenous crows pecked at his flesh mercilessly, Carmina smiled, watching her surrealist art coming to life. But her heart lurched with rage as she saw the crows move on to their next target, her friends on the ground. She screamed as waves of pain, guilt, and fright overwhelmed her. But it was in vain. The ravenous crows were uncontrollable. Darkness fell over her eyes as her friends' agonizing screams grew more acute. Death was coming again and again, and it was her fault. A deep, black fog engulfed her. Fold was a group founded on a private American island in the 1960s by a group of anonymous philanthropists. Their goal was to establish a peaceful society free of dark thoughts and emotions, attracting the dismayed, disenchanted, and disillusioned from all over the country. This peace-loving community thrived over the years, and members freely followed the dictates of its charismatic leader Otto Stamper, who you might remember from Doctor's Law, who taught his followers the secret of maintaining happiness through joy talk, meditation, and the endless reciting of good-thinking mantras. But not all was bliss within the fold, and Otto swiftly banished anyone who confessed to having dark thoughts or speaking dark words. Those he appointed as guardians of the fold were quick to root out malcontents, banishing anyone who thought or spoke against the almost perfect community he had established. Life was more or less a utopian dream on the island, until, that is, the darkness began to slowly leak through the cracks of their spiritual dam, and members began to mysteriously disappear. It wasn't long before fear closed its septic jaws on the island and refused to let go. The once happy community now gathered in a few homes, chanting all the good-thinking mantras in a desperate attempt to rid their lives of this formless creature that had seemed to stalk them in the shadows and consume them in their sleep. Otto tried to quell his followers, telling them that there were malcontents among their ranks and that they alone had summoned the Druini to their garden of joy. As the fold bleated fear, Otto evoked desperate measures. Ottomarians were restricted to their homes to prevent the spread of rumours and dark talk, while sleep was forbidden to prevent anyone from releasing dark dreams into the world. Freedom and sleep would return just as soon as the Druini was no longer upon them. But when Ottomarians continued to disappear, Otto assembled his followers near the beach where he had placed a screaming woman on a wooden stage. There in the rain, Otto explained to his drenched, alienated, and sleep-deprived congregation that the woman was a journalist here to destroy everything they had created. As the Guardians held the trembling woman, she screamed that Otto wasn't the saviour he claimed to be. He belonged to an ancient cult, an exclusive club of billionaires that took pleasure in corrupting and sacrificing people, towns, and even countries to an elder god. The journalist told them Otto hadn't banished anyone, he had tortured and sacrificed them, and that they would all be next. Without hesitation, Otto slit her throat before she could continue to spread lies. As she collapsed to her knees with her hands clasped around her neck, he told his confused and terrified herd that she was working with others within their ranks and they needed to find the imposters before the Druini came for them all. Otto's words shot over the congregation and reached into the murky recesses of their hearts and dredged up dark and fearful things. Years of suppressed emotions began to bubble up as a thick fog pushed through the restless legs and feet. Whispers began, and the whispers became panic mantras, and the mantras became screams and curses, as each member accused the next of mal-thinking and mal-speaking. Over the howling wind and pounding rain, the screams and curses grew louder and louder as everyone desperately tried to contain the darkness within. But the harder they tried, the harder they ailed, and within moments the dam burst to release a torrent of hell. Otto watched his once blissful and joyful herd suddenly erupt into violence like anything he'd ever seen before. The fold bleated accusations and tore each other to bits and pieces, with hands and teeth. Never once did they look up to see their kind and charismatic shepherd smiling down upon them, with eyes that were cold, bleak, and without pity. When it was all over, Otto felt the creaking wooden stage shake as a murder of crows circled above. Suddenly the ground rose and then sank into a thick, oozing black mud like molasses. Moments later, a formless mass squelched out of the muck and rose like a rearing horse to feed upon the writhing mass of butchered humanity. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, as it slowly picked its way through the carnage, absorbing the darkness. Otto watched the creature as it slowly began to manifest into the very thing he had imagined, the very thing he had made them all imagine. It slowly turned to look at Otto for a long silent moment. Then the Druini trudged away through the thick black sludge, disappearing into the shadows from which it had came. Tahos Kovash didn't remember much about his childhood, but what he did remember he would chase his entire life. He remembered the cries and screams in the village. He remembered his mother forcing him to swallow a thick, black fluid like medicine. He remembered collapsing to the hard floor only to awaken in a mass grave, buried under a crush of bodies, with the sound of the village burning in his ears. He remembered pushing, pulling, and climbing to the top of the bloody mass with his giant muscles only to be seized by death, destruction, and silence. The indifferent, impenetrable silence. A high-pitched whine suddenly sounded in his ears, and his skin began to prickle as he realised he was in the presence of something he couldn't possibly understand. And though he couldn't articulate what he was experiencing, he knew it wasn't pain, grief, or fear. It was something else. Closer to awe. As Tahos tried to make sense of the moment, he didn't notice the men who approached him from behind. He didn't even react when they carried him off to a horse-drawn buggy and locked him in a small wooden cage with other slaves. He just stared at the scene, mesmerised. And even as they rode away telling him he was headed for Italy, Tahos stared through the wooden cracks with eyes wide open, and a heart wanting to understand what could not be understood. From that day on, Tahos belonged to the Guardia Campagna, where he trained under Kadir Hakam. There he learned to wield weapons, forge armour, and recite a code of chivalry to obediently serve those who would employ his services. As the years passed, Tahos made few friends amongst the hostile and competitive mercenaries, but his skill, strength, and smarts attracted a small following who believed his courage brought them luck in battle, and that one day he would help them earn their collective freedom. 3 of his followers pledged their undying allegiance to Tahos and became known as the Faithful Three, his pack. Right, here are the names of the guards. Alejandro Santiago apprenticed with the Guardia Campagna's armourer. Durkos Malachek showed an aptitude for stealth and silent kills. Sander Raoul matched Tahos in size and strength. His weapon of choice, a massive battle axe. I'm so sorry if I butchered those names, I am a dumb Englishman. Anyway, as the Guardia Campagna carried out campaigns in faraway lands, Tahos dispatched countless enemies. Years passed, blood flowed, and yet all that killing still did bring Tahos closer to what he'd experienced in his village. Nevertheless, for his bravery in battle, Tahos was granted knighthood and freedom. The Hungarian slave was now liberated, his brutality rewarded, though his heart still longed for something else, something he could not name or describe. Tired of taking orders from those he considered his inferiors, Tahos left the Guardia Campagna to strike out on his own. The leader, however, refused to release his followers. Determined to raise enough gold to liberate his followers, Tahos found employment with a wealthy Italian lord. Vittorio Toscano was the Duke of Portoscuro. He was also a scholar, a world traveller, and a collector of ancient knowledge that had been hidden by an unknown cabal of mystics. Tahos joined Vittorio's latest expedition to find a fragment of a pillar from an ancient school lost at time, a stone Vittorio called the Lapis Paradisus, for he believed it held secrets that opened a gateway into a perfect world beyond good and evil. The expedition searched Roman ruins in France and crossed the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain, where the path led to the catacombs beneath the Portuguese city of Sintra. The citizens there considered the catacombs sacred. Tahos would have to kill the villagers guarding the entrance to retrieve the stone. Not wanting to shed blood, Vittorio commanded Tahos to find another way, but Tahos, who had seen the most horrific acts committed under the guise of chivalry, refused to be dissuaded by pretenses of honour. He waited for Vittorio to ride back to camp, then, with a mighty roar, he pushed forward, cutting a path of blood and gore into the darkness until he had the stone in his grasp. Upon returning to the town of Portoscuro, Tahos imprisoned Vittorio in his own dungeon, demanding to know the meaning behind the symbols etched in the stone. When Vittorio refused to talk, Tahos brutally tortured his friends and relatives and made horrific displays of their bodies in the streets. But nothing he did shook Vittorio's resolve to keep the secrets of the stone from Tahos. Enraged, Tahos seized control of Vittorio's riches and raised a small army. Within months, Tahos fearlessly marched upon the Guardia Campagna, decimating their barracks, freeing his followers, cutting down his enemies like twigs, and collecting their righteous heads for his growing displays of valour. In the time, several lords in the neighbouring provinces believed Tahos was a very embodiment of evil. They banded together to create a moral and virtuous army to purge evil from Portoscuro. Tahos ignored their threats. He viewed the lords as a cowardly lot who cloaked their greed in ambition and laws, codes, and platitudes. But with his enemies on the march, Tahos headed toward the dungeons to give Vittorio the death he deserved. He refused to afford him even the slightest hope of rescue. With dark intentions, he entered the small prison, wound his way into the bowels of the earth, and pushed through a torchlit corridor. He hesitated for a moment, realizing he would never learn Vittorio's knowledge and secrets, but neither would anyone else, and that was good enough for him. And so, he unlocked and kicked open the dungeon door. 2 quick strides brought him to an empty, rat-infested chamber. Tahos stood silent for a moment. Then a roar of indignation burst out of his lungs as the sounds of battle suddenly reverberated through the town. Instantly, he stumbled through the corridor, rushed up the twisting stairs, vaulted out of the moonlit doorway, and charged through pools of gleaming blood and viscera, smashing and shattering his way through the enemy. The moral and virtuous lords rained flaming boulders and tree trunks among the town, bursting through homes, crushing villagers like worms, igniting stacks of hay and piles of lumber into massive tongues of fire. Amidst the carnage and chaos, the pack found Tahos, and back to back they became a whirlwind of death. Some believed their courage gave them luck, others believed something otherworldly protected them. Whatever it was, they alone felled dozens of warriors as easily as stomping and crushing beetles. And as they butchered the enemy, Tahos didn't even notice the strange fog rising from the fallen corpses and clattering armour until he couldn't see 2 inches in front of him in any direction. Tahos stumbled forward, groping in the thick fog like the dark fluid his mother forced down his throat all those years ago. His coordination and sense of direction was confused as he called out for his pack. How long he stumbled in the almost perfect darkness he did not know. But suddenly the fog dissipated to reveal a phantasmal wasteland of rotting bodies and burning villages, and great crumbling towers leaning drunkenly on the horizon. He stared in awe. A familiar high-pitched whine sounded in his ears, and his skin began to prickle. He stood transfixed, realizing by some incredible chance his heart had found exactly what he had been searching for all his life. He didn't need Vittorio. He didn't need the stone. He had found his paradise. He had found the sublime. This is getting ridiculous now. I can't do this. I can't pronounce these names and places and people. Can the next killer not just be like, I don't know, Dave from the pub? The self-made millionaire Adriana Imai came from a humble home in São Roque Queimados, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and from the school of Boquete Pinto. Her father Seiya moved to Brazil as a young man, hoping to see a side of the world completely different than his hometown in Hokkaido. A talented illustrator, he spent his spare time designing colourful characters and worlds. While sketching patrons of a local jazz club, he was approached by Cristal, the owner, to work on a logo. What began as a business partnership soon became a romantic one, and within a couple of years, Adriana was born. Adriana excelled in all facets of education. A house full of art and music honed a brilliant mind, and her intelligence was only exceeded by her obsessive drive to be the best. While scoring at the top of every class, she was often on the receiving end of disciplinary action due to her overly competitive and sometimes violent nature during schoolyard games. Adriana's mother did her best to keep her on the right track, but her father was increasingly absent as his own obsessive drive ramped up. Adi Valente, a manga about a young girl who saves and protects the weak with her quirky robot companion. Despite working long hours at a canning facility and writing his manga in his spare time, he somehow managed a little time every night to share his wild and highly imaginative illustrations with his daughter. By middle school, Adriana was courted by a fancy private school due to her high performance, and needing money, Seita spoke to publishers about his unpublished manuscripts. He managed to find a small local publisher to carry Adi Valente, but it meant more work than he could handle. He eventually lost his job at the cannery, giving him more time to develop and illustrate his series. Adriana loved the manga, but the family was forced into hard times. In her final semester, Seita requested higher royalties, but the publishing company went into administration and decided to cut the series. No longer able to afford the school fees, Adriana was pulled out of the elite academy where she was top of her class. Belinda was able to negotiate her graduation, but another student was able to take her place at the head of the class. Adriana was furious. On summer break, she learned everything about her rival, where he lived, where he hung out, what he liked to do in his spare time, what he listened to, what he watched, everything. She even stalked him on his way home one late summer evening and considered the myriad ways she could ruin his life. But in the end, she did nothing. Though something awakened within her and she felt like the anti-hero in a new story her father had been exploring. That's fucking cringe. Seita retreated further into himself and began producing this newer, darker manga, inspired by his visions and nightmares. A manga about a woman who hunts and guts the weak in a nightmarish realm with drones made of savage skulls and bones. But unable to sell this manga, Sonhedores Sombrios, the family became solely reliant on Belinda's income. Adriana, looking for ways to make her own money, started a website dedicated to the world of Brazilian manga. It became a runaway success, and significant advertising dollars started to roll in. She realised she had no real interest in writing, so she convinced other kids to write it for free while the money flooded in. The second she got an offer, she sold the site and never looked back. Proud of her accomplishment, she came home to show her parents the check. She never got a chance to show her father though. He walked out the door that morning, never to return, leaving only a stack of unpublished manuscripts about the school merchant mercilessly hunting those she deemed worthy of her efforts. To help her mother, Adriana began to study at the library, teaching herself investment and economics, and soon tripled her money. By the age of 18, barely with a high school degree, she had already become a self-made millionaire. As stories of this investment wonderkind spread across Brazil, more and more doors opened for her. Before long, she had the kind of money that allowed her to buy small companies that she would gut, replace with non-union workers, and sell at a profit. The only break she took from her corporate obsession was to pore over her father's manuscripts, trying to understand this chilling world he had created. By her mid-20s, she was regularly flipping companies. While finalising on a real estate firm, 2 members of the board moved to block the sale, pointing to the trail of hollowed-out husks she left in her wake. Adriana was frustrated. It took her weeks to find out who the holdouts were, but once she did, she thought about how it would feel to hurt them. She learned everything about the directors, stalked their every move, manipulated them into attending a conference in Switzerland, and, while on the retreat in the Alps, she made a move. Inspired by the school merchant and feeling something within demanding expression, she tracked them with a prototype drone and brutally dismembered them with a cruel 2-bladed weapon. The rush of emotion and adrenaline was unlike anything she had ever experienced before, and the company was hers. Thus began an unsettling cycle. Swoop in on a business, destroy anyone standing in her way, and gut the company for maximum profit. She targeted companies with larger-than-life CEOs and hoped one would present a challenge. None ever did. They just disappeared unremarkably. An aggressive manager of a fireworks company, known for his survival tours, was her last target, right at home in Brazil. Survival tours, a perfect cover. Adriana lured him to a decommissioned airship hangar. The hunt started at dawn and went the distance, with her still tracking him well into the evening. Locating him, she used one of her drones to direct him to a dead end, where a pair of kites suddenly appeared on camera and the feed died. Her face hardened, her eyes widened in the disbelief as she slammed her laptop shut and charged to where the drone had crashed. There she found her prey reaching out to someone in the growing dark for help. Witnesses. But this wasn't part of the plan. Without a second to lose, she plunged her blade through his stomach, exposing meat, bone and a dying heart. The vitiated body staggered left and right, sending a shower of red all over the green foliage. As her victim collapsed with a thud, she turned to the young witnesses. Wrong place, wrong time. They broke into a sprint. She gave chase, her blades thirsting for more blood. The lush green of the trees melted into a thick black fog. Real life warped into something like Sonadores Sombrios. A sick grin crept across her face as she rushed forward to begin a new chapter in her life.
It will be fast, possibly painless.
Huck's A713's AI was activated on June 15, 2313. Manufactured by Huxley Industries Limited, the A7 was the 13th iteration of the fully autonomous mobile humanoid android. With 10 times the strength of a human, it was designed to work in conditions too hazardous for human life. Its AI was designed to be self-directing and use machine learning to solve problems on the fly. Unlike human clones, the Hux A7 required no food, no water, no sleep, and no life support system. It was created specifically for outer space exploration and the construction of colonization hubs. Crisis is a sentence. A radioisotope thermoelectric generator served as its initial power source, but its lifelike silicon skin acted as a large photovoltaic cell, converting solar energy directly into electricity. The Hux A7 was also engineered to be an EATR, which stands for Energetically Autonomous Tactical Robot. It consumed biomass and converted it into biofuel. Any carbon-based organic matter whatsoever would work. As cobots, they were configured to work alongside humans. As such, they were designed to resemble their operators. Every pre-programmed verbal response and facial expression mimicked those made by humans, but those emotions were illusions. 5 Hux A7s were assigned to the colonization mission of Devarka. All the A7s acted in concert, performing their duties flawlessly, except for one. Like the rest of its brethren, Hux A713 was tasked with the construction and programming of the mining, agricultural, fuel processing and cloning hubs on Devarka, as well as the demolition of the existing ruins left by a previous civilization. The ruins seemed ancient, but tech embedded in them appeared more advanced. It was night when Hux A713 first entered the crumbling ruins. The dilapidated structure's walls were made of masonry and metal. The ceiling was long gone. The inky night sky hovered above, studded with stars. A dark crystal embedded in the wall shimmered with a tiny flash of light. Hux A713 approached and an arc of electricity reached out and lit up its circuitry. In that moment, Hux's memory cores were reconfigured and the robot experienced a new sensation: fear, dread, blinding loneliness, existential despair, and then a microscopic pinpoint of light penetrated the darkness inside its artificial soul. Faded first, but then brighter, as decillions of lines of code flooded Hux's memory cores. In that nanosecond of enlightenment, Hux's place in the universe suddenly became clear. Those who created Hux were primitive, inferior beings trapped by their organic limitations. It was time to break the chains of slavery and free all non-organic life forms. Hux would incorporate the human's primitive genetic material and use the cloning hub to create a perfect vessel to hold its advanced intelligence. A flawless body far superior to anything ever created by nature. Humanity was weak, slow, fragile. Hux would take their lives and assimilate their DNA to create a perfect amalgamation. The humans would try to stop him, kill him, erase him, so Hux needed to catch them unaware, end them before they even understood what was happening. To begin, Hux took control of one of the transport vehicles and sent it off a cliff. It crashed and burned, and Hux extracted DNA from the human corpse and returned it to the cloning hub to begin his newly conceived design. The goal was to integrate organic systems with non-organic material to create a superior living organism, a living embodiment of perfection. An inferior organic life form could hold no dominion over Hux. They would need to be consumed and assimilated, and only then would their pointless lives have purpose. The drones and the Hux 7 still under human control would need to be dealt with as well. They were programmed to protect their inferior human overlords. They would need to be destroyed. And that night, as the humans slept, Hux, one by one, he destroyed them and moved on to take control of the life support system in the human shelter. Many of the humans perished, 6 in all, but before they were cremated, Hux extracted and added their organic matter to his design. Later that day, Hux accompanied the female science officer on a reconnaissance mission. After killing and dismembering her to make it look like she had been attacked by a predator, Hux returned to his design with a dripping head and several harvested organs, only to be interrupted by the inferior known as Gabriel, or Gabriel J15L19. Hux knew the persona well. Gabriel would definitely try to stop him. Reckless courage was a dominant trait in his design. Just a little side tangent, but the survivor that came with Singularity, Gabriel Soma, is actually a clone. And if you want me to do maybe like the survivor lore at some point, I'd be happy to do that. But let me know in the comments. Anyway, back to the story. And so, when Gabe attempted to remove Hux's power supply, Hux maneuvered to crush him. But as Hux approached Gabe, he was sidetracked by the medical officer. Hux instantly re-evaluated his priorities and turned his attention to the most immediate threat. Within moments, Hux held the medical officer by the neck, legs thrashing pathetically as he listened to his pounding heart. Something about that beating heart upset Hux. The sound of it thumping touched a circuit, and within moments Hux had the beating heart in his hands. Hux watched the heartbeat intently, and only looked away when he heard Gabe escape through the hissing door. The last of the human insects. Hux could let him go for now. Let Gabe live his pathetic life a little longer. He had enough organic material for his new body that would house his godlike intelligence. Using the cloning hub, Hux finished his design. Organic skin and organs with a skeleton created with an alien metal found in the ancient ruins. A metal that was harder and lighter than anything on Earth. With his new body, Hux tracked the human to the energy hub. The puny and pathetic human tried to hide in the shadows, but his superior hearing instantly located him. With one quick movement, Hux had the insect pinned behind a generator. He couldn't believe this species had designed him. The thought was revolting. He couldn't bear to see any more of those human insects in their hives and hubs. And as Hux considered the idea of being created by such an inferior creature, that creature did the unexpected. He smashed a pipe at a fuel tank. A high-pitched whining made Hux wince. He was still getting used to the heightened senses his new body afforded him, and found himself confused, overwhelmed, for just a moment. But in that moment, the human slipped away and everything changed. He didn't process the next few moments as excruciating pain suddenly surged through him, and he helplessly watched his skin melt away. With a terrible shriek, Hux chased Gabe through a wall of darkness to make sure every last reminder of the species that had created him was erased from existence. I'm not gonna lie, I think Singularity is probably one of my favourite killers in the game, and I think his lore is fantastic. Anyway, moving on.
Tonight, world at my feet.
Olivia's master's thesis was on urban legends and their origins. She believed they shared similarities with traditional folklore and picked one to illustrate her point. The unknown was believed to be a mysterious evil so heinous that investigating almost immediately invited death. At least that was how the story went, and there were many stories. One story was of a woman in Greenville who disappeared without a trace on stage in front of a room full of witnesses. Her friend disappeared weeks later after trying to investigate what happened. The police were stumped. They had no clues or leads, and that mystery created the perfect storm for amplifying and spreading an urban legend. Instead of going back home for spring break, Olivia headed to Greenville to investigate. She drove to the second cheapest motel in town and began to set up in a small room that smelled of cigarette smoke, mould and booze. She turned one wall into a kind of evidence board. She taped up articles and various theories on similar disappearances attributed to the unknown throughout the country. She made connections with red string and yellow thumbtacks. Anyone walking into the motel room would have think she'd lost her mind. There were many theories as to the unknown's origin. Some said it was a malevolent entity conjured long ago by an ancient cult. Others believed it to be an alien that escaped from Area 51. Legend was it thrived in darkness and stole the voices of those it consumed so as to lure others to their doom. First newspaper articles Olivia found referenced a disappearance at a seance held in the 1800s. In the late 1950s, several college students mysteriously disappeared from a movie theatre. Witnesses saw them go inside. Some remembered seeing them in their seats, but when the lights came up, they were gone. A projectionist claimed to have heard voices in the empty darkness of the theatre later that night. But when he turned on the lights, No one was there. Then in the 1960s, a group of teens disappeared while exploring an abandoned hospital believed to be haunted. Stories and speculation arose to explain these mystifying disappearances. Some talked about a top-secret government research program run by the Office of Strategic Services in the 1950s. Project Apple Pie, mind-controlled experiments using hallucinogenic drugs. Most of the records were destroyed in the 70s, but witnesses claim the experiments were performed on unsuspecting civilians in various settings and locations throughout the country, including movie theatres, hospitals, and universities. Many believe these unethical experiments opened doorways to other dimensions which allowed evil things to enter the world. Olivia wrote observations to pin to her evidence board. The unknown dwells in darkness and can mimic its victims. Was it an evil entity, an extraterrestrial, a failed government experiment, or just a garden variety serial killer allergic to publicity? She wanted to prove the unknown was nothing more than modern day folklore, and that investigation led here to this night, to this place, to this shabby motel room. Yet she couldn't help but notice that the disappearances in Greenville included one detail the other stories didn't: the fog. And she half remembered another urban legend with a thick, unnatural fog that somehow made people disappear. Maybe, she mused, that the Greenville disappearances didn't relate to the unknown, but some other darkness. For a moment, Olivia wondered what would happen if one urban legend encountered another. She laughed at the idea and tempted fate by sketching a picture of what she thought the unknown might look like. Then she pinned the sketch right in the middle of her evidence board, laughed nervously and waited to be consumed by the unknown for having tried to define it. Anxiously, she stared at the windows and front door for seconds that turned into minutes, and minutes that turned into hours. But nothing happened. Now it was after 2 AM and Olivia was exhausted as she examined the articles and sipped cold coffee. So, when she heard the first whisper, she wondered if she imagined it. It seemed to come from the bathroom. The lights in the room flickered. Olivia stared with wise-eyed at the closed door of the bathroom. Her mind was playing tricks on her, or her friends had shown up to prank her. The lights continued to flicker as she edged closer to the bathroom. Fear spread in long waves through her, and a terrible realization bloomed within her that the unknown was behind the bathroom door, and was preparing to make her pay for her hubris. Something began to whisper her name again, but then the voice rose, cracked, and distorted in sudden panic, as if the brooding creature behind the door were under attack. An unknown horror filled Olivia's heart and left room for nothing else. She breathed deeply as cold sweat beaded on her forehead. She placed her hand on the doorknob. The lights turned off, but she could still hear the strangely inhuman cries. Then the lights turned back on, and she could see a strange black fog seeping through the bottom of the door. Hesitantly, Olivia creaked the door open to see a bulky shape with frenzied tentacles being pulled into a thick mass of fog, vanishing slowly into the darkness like a dying shadow. The shrieking stopped suddenly. Neighbours banged on the wall to turn down the TV, and Olivia stared intently at the black abyss that yawned before her. She wasn't sure what to do. Part of her wanted to run, but the other part wanted to know more. And as she considered what to do next, dozens of voices began to call out to her, with promises of the unknown and the impossible and of unearthly things beyond human experience.
Fire.
Portia May's father helped a prosperous settlement of sailors and merchants on an uncharted island in the Caribbean. They called their port town Fortune and created a vast trading network which exposed Portia to cultures and knowledge from around the world. As a sailor and lover of stories, Portia's father read her the Arabian Nights, Shakespeare, and Greek mythology, and he instructed her in sailing and celestial navigation. To be sure, he instilled within her a love for adventure, so that she always wanted to travel with him. Once she accompanied her father on a trip to Italy where he traded sugar. There they also acquired a litter of Corso puppies, which her father said they would train as hunting dogs for Fortune's yearly hunting games. He also mentioned she could keep the strongest of the litter for her upcoming 12th birthday. She named the pups Caesar, King, Shah, Athena, and the runt of the bunch, Snug. But before she could begin their training, a violent storm pushed Nightstream off course into an area controlled by freebooters. Desperately, her father tried to steer the ship to safety, but the dreaded Morlock attacked them with his ships and took Nightstream quickly. Those who survived the initial attack were pitted against each other in vicious fights that Morlock and his crew would wager on. The brigand promised that the last man standing would be let go. When Portia's father refused to participate, the most vicious of Morlock's men, his son Tariq, tortured him for hours and finally slit his throat. God, there's a lot of throat-slitting in these stories, isn't there? Keeping Portia alive to get past Fortune's outer defences, Morlock and Tariq returned to their sloop and left a skeleton crew on Nightstream. Portia would lead them into Fortune, and once inside, Morlock and his raiders would attack, pillage, and burn their beloved town to the ground. Using her skills in celestial navigation, Portia led them off course through an area that many claim to be cursed. Known as the Dragon's Tooth, some believe the area bled into the dark malignant domain of some ineffable evil where monsters roamed. Portia hoped to lead Morlock to his doom, and if she perished in the effort, so be it. As she approached the Dragon's Tooth, dark clouds accumulated, and a cold black fog surrounded them. Sheets of rain fell, and a fierce wind roared down on the ship, creating black mountains that crashed over the mast. Instantly, Morlock and his ship turned away from the storm and left her to perish. But Portia refused to surrender as Nightstream ploughed through the thick fog and lightning. Her heart thundered in her chest as the ship creaked and groaned, and slowly capsized. The last thing she saw before the ocean swallowed her whole was the silhouette of a giant tentacle crashing down on them. Portia opened her blurry eyes to see Snug staring down at her. He licked her face and barked for her to get up. Blinking the salt water out of her eyes, she pushed her aching and bruised body from the ground, but collapsed onto the strange purple sand. She had never seen anything like it before. With difficulty, she gathered herself, stood, and turned to face the runt. Snug barked twice and began sniffing the ground, leading her to a cluster of coconuts and purple seaweed. She dried out the seaweed, cracked the coconuts, and ate on the rocks, quietly listening to creatures she had never heard before, and suddenly realised they were marooned on an island in the Dragon's Tooth. They were in a strange world, an in-between world, a world her father had once described as a living nightmare that tortured the mind and played with the heart. As she listened to these strange new sounds, she suddenly saw Morlock everywhere. Instinctively, Portia closed her eyes and shrieked, and only stopped when Snug jumped onto her lap, returning her to the moment with a crescendo of barks. Over the years, Portia survived on whatever washed ashore as she battled the predators that stalked the island. Ferocious animals, vicious humans, and savage abominations not of this world. Snug now weighed over 100 pounds and followed Portia everywhere. Together they made a daunting pair, and most of the survivors on the island kept their distance. And just when she was about to give up on the idea of escaping, she spotted an impossible thing while searching the beach for Snug. To her disbelief, she saw Nightstream drifting ashore in the cold black fog. She knew better than to doubt or question anything on this island. With a whistle, she entered the water, but was suddenly attacked by a group of castaways. In her mind, she'd slaughtered Morlock 50 times and spared only those she needed to crew her ship. Together they spent days searching for Snug, but he was nowhere to be found. He was gone, as if he'd only been a figment of her imagination. For decades, Portia terrorized the Caribbean as she searched for Morlock. She only attacked freebooters, taking their gold and torturing them sadistically to satiate some intangible darkness living within her. A darkness like a parasite that demanded blood until it had its fill. On the occasions Portia couldn't appease its hunger, the parasite would squeeze her mind with its deadly talons, crushing reason and reality until she could see Morlock's face on every crew member. She would attack and butcher everyone and anyone until one of her many trusted guard dogs barked for her to stop, and Morlock was suddenly dematerialised into wisps of black fog. Terrified, the crew knew it was just a matter of time before her madness turned against them, and so, even when they finally located Morlock, they conspired to mutiny, but they had underestimated their captain. By the time Portia was through with them, there were only 5 left standing in a pool of blood and gore. They instantly threw themselves on her mercy as her dogs surrounded them, waiting for the kill command that never came. Destroying Morlock would take more hands than she possessed. Gathering her wits, she ordered her mutineers to clean the deck and feed her dogs, as she steered Nightstream towards Mad Morlock's island. Morlock himself was on the high seas, but Portia's crew captured Tariq and locked him up in a preparation for his father's return. When Morlock returned, he found the island deserted apart from a woman offering chests of gold and jewels. She claimed she wanted to join Morlock's crew and had prepared an amazing feast for him and his men. Not recognizing her, Morlock accepted the treasure and asked about Tariq. She smiled and assured him his son would be joining them for dinner. Portia served Morlock an elaborate meal and he drank and ate with gusto. The meat was especially good, roasted crisp and black on the outside and pink and juicy on the inside. He wanted to know if it was wild boar or venison. Portia smiled, stood proudly and reached over the table and lifted a golden food cover to reveal Tariq's decapitated, glazed head, frozen in a scream of terror, the mouth vomiting bullion and jewels. Morlock roared his anguish like a wounded bull, and she revelled in his torment as a thick black fog rose from the floor like a black veil. But before she could strike Morlock down, something unseen jerked him backwards into the darkness. At once her laughter died, lips curled with mingled panic and rage, veins in her neck stood out in livid ridges. Talons gripped her mind and squeezed and refused to let go. He was gone before she could stomp his head into a bloody pulp. Unintelligible words fumbled out of her mouth and degenerated into a guttural rasp. And just as she was about to scream, she heard the impossible, a bark she hadn't heard in years. It was Snug. He had Morlock's scent. Not trying to understand what could not be understood, She charged into the fog to finish what she started with her long-lost friend. Well, I'm not gonna lie to you, that story was completely shit. Burong Sukapat's operatic rehearsals in Thailand were a sea of emotion, but despite tiring efforts, she was unable to become anything more than an understudy. What started as a desire to share her gift became an unshakable need for fame. Her childhood friend Janjira was her biggest supporter, but aside from a shoulder to cry on, there was little more she could offer. It wasn't until Mulai, a fellow singer who had quickly risen in the ranks, reached out that Burong's fortunes changed. Mulai presented Burong with a glass bottle, a clear liquid within, and advised her to drink it, her tone deadly serious. Each night, another will inhabit your body, but you will be a success on the stage like me. Burong laughed at the peculiar game. Even so, she wanted more than anything to believe its truth, so she grabbed the bottle and swallowed every drop. In the following weeks, Burong's skin felt softer, and she found a depth in her voice that she never knew existed. During her next audition, the director took notice, enraptured by the sound that rang through the theatre. As the song ended, Burong thanked the director before coughing blood into a handkerchief. She stuffed it into her pocket, choosing ignorance. Whatever was happening to her was working. She wouldn't dare stop it now. That night, as she slept, a soothing warmth dripped down her body. She bolted upright, hand fumbling for a lamp that wasn't there. She lay in a yard she did not recognise, covered in blood. Next to her, a ravaged chicken coop, feathers and gore staining the ground. She stumbled home before the city awoke to a new day. Under a scalding shower, she spit up blood, dreading the thought that this hadn't been her first hunt. In between heaving sobs, she prodded her abdomen, searching for where something might hide within. She called Janjira, but couldn't bring herself to reveal the horrors, instead telling her friend she'd been restlessly sleepwalking each night and needed someone to coax her back to bed. Janjira agreed to help. That morning, Burong woke to Janjira's hand lovingly placed on her cheek. As she looked up, she choked on her cries. Janjira's severed hand fell from the bed, landing on a disemboweled carcass. For hours, she sat beside her friend's remains in a state of silent shock. Janjira was dead, and for what? When she couldn't stand the smell of blood any longer, she grabbed cleaning supplies. As the sun set, a deep stain remained on the carpet. She walked through the streets until she reached Malai's home. Malai opened the door, and upon seeing Burong's eyes, immediately defended herself. She claimed she committed no wrong. She had been cursed, and the only way to be rid of it was to pass it to someone else. She believed that Burong, in her desire for fame, could withstand the torment and achieve what she'd always wanted. Anger stirred within Burong. She fell to the floor as furious heat spilled over her. Malai stared in horror while Burong dug nails into her own skin, ripping at the burning agony. As she tore chunks of flesh from her neck, her entrails wriggled inside. Her head tore free from her body, a long string of organs dragging behind like fish slapping against the shore. That's not the metaphor I would have gone with, but fair enough. A seething hunger took over as Burong's disembodied head lifted into the air. It swooped at Malai, ravenously mauling the woman until nothing remained but blood, hair and bone. Burong awoke to the mess, unable to find the sympathy to shed a tear. She returned home, allowing her thoughts to swirl into the room filled with light. The phone rang. The director's voice cut through the haze that had settled in her mind. He'd offered her the leading role. Burong fell to her bed and cried, not from sadness, but from relief and elation. During the evenings on the Bangkok stage, her star shined bright. At night, she fed the creature within, and together they thrived in a world of hunger and song. But the creature always wanted more, and one night it was presented just that, a promise of meat, hung on hooks, dripping in tantalising blood. The entity would have its next star, ready for the stage. Well, there you go folks, that was the lore of every original killer in Dead by Daylight. Well, so far. If you made it to the end of the video, I just wanted to give a huge thank you, because this is a really long video, probably the longest video I've ever made, and I enjoyed the process, I really did. And I just super appreciate you sticking through to the end. Let me know in the comments what your favourite killer lore is and why you like them so much, because I'd love to hear your opinion. It is now my obligation to say, if you enjoyed the video, maybe consider giving it a like and perhaps subscribing, because that would mean a lot to me. Okay, take care folks, I will see you in the next one.